tell you a story this morning that if it doesn't reinforce your belief in the perfect timing of God, I don't know what will. If it doesn't stir some emotion in you about how tough life can be sometimes, then I'm not sure that there's any emotion there to stir up. On September 30th, we started this series on why bad things happen, often to who we consider good people, last Sunday of September. And if you were here that day, you may remember that I told a story about a young soldier in my unit in Germany whose baby girl, 4-month-old, died suddenly at home one night. What you don't know is at this service that day, the 11 o'clock service, September 30th, as I'm telling that story about the death of the 4-year-old baby in Germany, there's a man here in that service who's finding out at that moment that his 19-month-old granddaughter died at home that morning. Now, that's Sunday the 30th. That Thursday, October 4th, we went to the cemetery out south of town, and we buried that 19-month-old baby girl. Tragedy's even worse because not too far from that baby girl's grave in the same cemetery is the grave of that baby's 24-year-old mother, who we buried last Christmas Eve after she was killed in a car wreck. The baby, who was about 10 months old at the time of the car accident, was in the car with her mom when she had the wreck. The mom was, we believe, killed almost instantly. It was a pretty horrific accident. But the 10-month-old baby girl escaped the wreck uninjured, only to die 9 months later of an accident at home. Now, tell me God's timing is not perfect. I had no clue. I had no clue how relevant that talking about why bad things happen, how relevant that would be for a family right here in our midst. I can't plan that. Only God knew who would be here that day. Only God knew what they needed to hear. Only God knew. If that doesn't reinforce your understanding about how important it is to believe and to understand that we have to trust the sovereign God for some unanswered questions, I don't know what would. I had no clue that day how important it would be for me to stand up here and tell people that God is sovereign. That even when you don't feel like He's in control, even when things seem out of control, even when you don't understand, God is in charge. And whether He answers your questions or not, you need to trust Him. Because, folks, I'll tell you, I don't have, to this day, I don't have very many answers for that family. And we're still searching through that today. We have looked so far in a broad, overarching way. Why do bad things happen? Well, we've seen that bad things happen in kind of an overarching way because when sin came in to God's good creation, it just messed up everything. It messed us up. It messed up nature, and it invited all kinds of bad things into God's good world. Disease, natural disasters, demonic activity, all things that were just invited in to the good thing that God made. But you see, that's a little bit too far from home. To talk about Adam and Eve sinning and inviting sin in general into the world, that's a little bit too far. See, because we're going to talk today about our own lives. Do you realize that you and I, all by ourselves, are perfectly capable of doing a lot of dumb things? We don't need a lot of help to bring bad things into our lives. You and I, all by ourselves, without the devil's temptation, without any external nudging, you and I have a tremendous ability to mess things up. And sometimes when we do, it brings bad things into our lives. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We have the freedom to bring bad things upon ourselves. Now, grab a Bible. You're going to have to look up 3 places. You're going to hold and mark the first 2, and then we'll come back to those. The first place I want you to look up is in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. If you're using our Bibles, make it easy on you. It's page 788. 788 in our Bibles will put you near Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Mark that. Hold your place. Put a piece of paper there so you can come back to it quickly. The next place I want you to find is at the front of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. Matthew 12, 36, page 690 in our Bibles. Page 690. Mark that one. Hold your place there. Keep it handy. And then the place we're going to start reading, Romans chapter 3, verse 23. Page 797. Okay, so we're looking at Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Mark that. We're looking at Matthew 12, 36. Mark that. And we're going to start with Romans 3, 23. Still hear some pages rustling, so I'll give you a moment to find those. Now let me just tell you, this is kind of a common sense sermon today. There's no deep theological mysteries unfolded here today about why bad things happen. Some of the reason bad things happen is just pretty common sense answers, if you think about it. So that's what we're focused on here today. Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That means that we are free to sin. And sin will bring a lot of bad stuff into your life. Nothing mysterious about that. It says every one of us, not most of us, not some of us, not the vast majority of us, but all have sinned. You may be the most morally upright, most spiritual person on earth, but you are included in this. You have sinned and fallen short of God's plan for your life. What that really means is not that we were required to sin, but that we were all given the freedom to obey God or not, and every single one of us have abused that freedom to go our own way. And let me tell you, when we choose to disobey God, when we choose to color outside the lines that God gives us for life, when we choose to live our lives on our own without following His guidelines, we are just asking for bad stuff to come into our lives. And then sometimes we throw up our hands and we say, why did this happen to me? Well, you're living your life outside of God's plan. You're out there living it on your own. You're free to do that. But when it happens, don't throw up your hands and say, why me, God? It's because you did it. If I'm guilty of a sin and it brings junk into my life, I shouldn't whine to God about it. I should go look in the mirror and see who's responsible. We're free to do all kinds of horrific things. You know, all around here, all around anywhere you go in America today, people are free to abuse illegal drugs. And then when they get diseases from it, or they get sick from it, or they get caught and put in jail from it, is that God's fault? No. But you know, I have sat with people who were in jail because they got caught with drugs, and it's, why me, Lord? Hey, let me tell you a secret. It's because you did it. It's because you chose to sin. And sin brings bad stuff into your life sometimes. But you know, the thing is, we also need to realize sin doesn't always just affect me. Sin has an amazing ability to spill over and get on you. My personal sin, not anything you did. Our personal specific sins have an amazing ability to impact people who are innocent bystanders and have nothing to do with what we did. Maybe they didn't even know we were doing it, but it just oozes out. Sin makes everybody around you dirty in terms of bringing harmful effects on them. Those of you who've lived around here for several years, if you think back to November of 2007, almost 5 years ago, one of the worst traffic accidents in Alabama history happened between here and Dothan on Highway 84. A young family, father and mother, husband and wife in their 30s. They weren't doing anything except driving home one night. Had their 5 children in the van. Some guy under the influence of alcohol chose to get drunk and drive, drove the wrong way in the lane, hit that van, killed the wife, the mother, and killed 4 out of 5 children. 1 child and the father survived. Think about the web of pain and sorrow that is still being spread from that today. You know, you had innocent people killed. You have innocent relatives and friends who had to get that tragic news that night. They're still grieving the loss of those people. It will be a 5-year anniversary coming up. You don't think they're going to think about that and hurt all over again? There's 1 child without a mom. There's a father, a husband without a wife. And whose sin caused that? Just the sin of 1 man. That family was just driving home. They didn't sin. None of their relatives or friends brought it on. God didn't make him do it. It was an abuse of the freedom that God gives us to go our own way. And he chose to go his own way that night and to get drunk and drive. And his sin splashed all over innocent people. Folks, every day you can read about that in the newspaper. Joyce tells me I'm old-fashioned. She says I shouldn't say newspaper anymore. I like a paper in my hands. So you can read that every day on your iPad or your smartphone or on your computer, wherever you read the news. I'm trying to get up to date here. Every day you can read about people, one person who commits a sin, and the spillover effect is horrific on other people. You know, it's bad enough if I choose personally to go my own way and thumb my nose at God. But you know what? I should stop and think, who else is going to get hurt when I do this? Who else is going to be affected by this? You know, even those things that we sometimes think are private sins, let me tell you a secret. There's no such thing as a private sin. The Bible says, be sure your sins will find you out, and that whatever we do in the darkness will be exposed in the light. There's no such thing as a private sin. You know, one of the most horrific things, as a pastor I run across sometimes, I've seen a lot of lives destroyed by, unfortunately, guys, it's usually us, by guys looking at pornography. And they do it in private, and they think it's, you know, it's okay, I'm not hurting anybody. You know, there's no other real person involved. Nobody's going to get hurt. I have seen the germs of that sin spread to families and those around when somebody thought, hey, it's just me, it's just a private sin. And yet sometimes people will throw up their hands, why me, God? Why did this happen to me? Because you have the freedom to sin, and sometimes that sin will wreck your life and the life of others. Now there's another common sense thing. Go back to the verse I asked you to look up in Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. This may be even more common sense. Matthew 12:36. Simple verse. It says, but I tell you that men will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken. You know, it's not always a sin to be careless, but sometimes it can really hurt you. This verse only specifically talks about careless words, but doesn't it follow by common sense that if I'm free to speak careless words and bring harm to myself or others, that I'm free to do careless things? We are free to be careless. God gave us a brain, we're free not to use it. Okay? We're free to ignore what we've been taught. We're free to go into situations and be careless. I told you not long ago about this is probably, well, I know it is, this is the most careless thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm thankful to this day that nobody got hurt. And I told you not long ago, about a time I went deer hunting with a .50 caliber muzzle loading rifle. And that, for those of you who don't know, that's the old-fashioned kind. You pour the black powder down the barrel, and then you ram a lead ball down the barrel. And the way you get it to go off is you put a percussion cap where the hammer will hit it. You pull the hammer back, pull the trigger, hammer goes forward, hits the cap sparks, the spark hits the powder, and there's a controlled explosion as that powder goes off and shoots that lead ball out the end of the gun. It's about like shooting a small cannon. Well, I went hunting one day with one of those, and if you don't know, wet powder is no good. It was raining that morning, and I was still going hunting, and I thought, well, I know I shouldn't do this, but it's raining. I'm pretty sure I can, this will be okay just this one time. So I loaded the powder and the ball in the rifle before I left my house. Now, that's not a smart thing to do, but I'm talking to myself thinking, hey, well, that's okay, because the only way it's going to go off is if I put the cap on it and pull the hammer back. And I'm not going to do that because I'm too smart to do that. So we get to the woods and everything's fine, and it's still raining. Well, if you get that percussion cap wet, then it won't ignite the powder. So I thought, just this one time, just this once, because I'm pretty sure I'll be okay, I'm going to put the cap on there, and it'll be okay because I'm not going to pull the hammer back. So in the dark, I did that and got ready to get out, and I was sitting in this little 2-seat Toyota pickup, and I reached down, I got my rifle, and I slid it carefully across my lap toward the driver's door. Somewhere in the dark, the hammer caught on my pants, and it pulled that hammer back just enough that when it got past what it was caught on, it went boom, and there was a .50 caliber explosion in the confines of that little pickup. And I'm sitting there choking on black powder, smoke, and I'm being honest, I'm trying not to have a bowel movement or wet myself. And there's a .50 caliber hole in the door, driver's door of my new shiny red Toyota pickup. Now, there's only one redeeming part of this story. That is, I had a guy hunting with me that day. And like a lot of hunters do, he wanted to use the bathroom before he went into the woods. He had gotten ready and gotten out before I did and was at the front of that little truck using the bathroom when that explosion went off, and he literally wet himself all over. That was the only good part of that whole story. But let me tell you, why did I tell you that? I want you to think about it with me. What if I had shot myself that day, or God forbid, even worse, what if I had shot my friend that day? Would it have been God's fault? No. It's been my fault, because I didn't use the brain He gave me. I was careless. I knew better than to have a loaded weapon in the truck. I've been taught that all my life. That's been driven into me. I knew better than to do that, but I was careless. And so if tragedy had struck that day, nobody would need to ask the question, why? Because the answer would have been clear. Donnie Thrasher was careless. Folks, we had the ability to do some incredibly thoughtless, careless things. Every day around us, people are hurt and injured by carelessness. You know that almost 20,000 people will be killed this year in their home from an accident in their home. They'll fall off ladders. Some of you, this is going to hurt you. They'll fall off chairs that they're using for ladders. Anybody ever do that? Yeah, I hear a ripple going through here. You know what? God gave us a brain for a reason, and we're supposed to use it. We're supposed to remember what we've been taught. People will trip on stairs when there's a toy left on a step. God doesn't leave toys on steps. People do. God doesn't make us climb on a rickety chair to reach something. We do that all by ourselves. And we have the ability to do this and hundreds of other careless things because God isn't careless. We are. And sometimes, tragically, carelessness leads to bad things happening to good people. And when it does, it's sad. And people don't need to hear it when their family members injured or killed in a careless accident. But the truth is still the same. It happened because they didn't think and they didn't do what they knew they should do. Okay, we're free to sin. We're free to be careless. One more thing that we're free to do. Go back to that verse I asked you to find in Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verse 7, I think I said. This is one of my favorite stories because it really makes me look good as a preacher, okay? And you're going to find out why in just a minute. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. Now just let me read that again. He kept on preaching until midnight. You should really appreciate me. Okay? There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, he said, he's alive. Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. We are free to take risks. And if you're going to listen to anybody preach from about 8 p.m. till midnight, don't sit in a third story open window. Because that is beyond careless. That is risky behavior. And we're free to take risk in life. We're free to know the consequences. Carelessness is when you just don't think. But we're free to know that the consequences could be bad. And we choose to go ahead and chance it anyway. This guy, third floor window, open. And he fell asleep and fell out, and it killed him. After Paul had preached from about 8 p.m. to midnight. Probably the worst that will happen to you if you fall asleep here is you might hit the floor and be embarrassed or snore. We had a little boy snoring in the first service this morning. So I'm capable of putting you to sleep in just a few minutes. But you're not likely to die during one of my sermons. Not likely, okay? But the good news is, by the power of God working through Paul that night, God restored this young man's life. The bad news is they all went back inside and Paul preached until daylight. I have actually been criticized for preaching sermons that are too short. So if you'd like to meet up here some night at 8 o'clock, we'll just go all night long. We'll see how you feel after that. Okay? You'll appreciate me then. Now, we had the freedom to do risky things, folks. I remember as a kid, all of us, wanted to be all kinds of weird things when we were a kid. At least I did. I had like 30 careers before I grew up and finally found one. But I for a while as a kid, I wanted to be a rodeo cowboy. And before my dad died, he spent some of his hard-earned money, and he bought me a little nag of a horse. And I was going to be a rodeo cowboy until that stinking little pony bucked me off about 5 or 6 times. And I kind of realized, hey, this ain't my calling in life. But to take this further, what if I'd pursued that and I find myself on the back of some 1,000-pound bull who doesn't really want me on his back, and he bucks me off and stomps the you-know-what out of me? Is it God's fault? And I hope there's no bull riders in here. No, That's because it's stupid, risky behavior. Let me tell you, if you're a NASCAR fan, you know, don't say, why God did my favorite driver get hurt? It's because he's driving around a track at 200 miles an hour with about 40 other idiots. 41. It's risky behavior. You know, there's a lot of things that we do that aren't sins, but when something happens, because you take the risk, it's not God's fault. You know? But all the time I hear people blame God when it's like, well, you know, you can't say that to be unkind to people, but, you know, I think to myself sometimes, well, duh. You know? Why were you doing that? It's risky. And well, you know, there are probably no NASCAR drivers or bull riders in here. So let me bring this a little bit closer to home. Some of you are going to get real uncomfortable in just a minute. Any of you ever, you know, you're in a hurry? Students, you know, you got to get to school. You're on your way to work. And you see that light turn yellow. But, you know, you're pretty sure you can make it. I'll tell you what. People don't only go through on yellow down here at the intersection by the Ford place. When it turns green, you better wait about 5 seconds because about 3 cars are going to come through on red. Any of them ever been you? I mean, I'm pretty sure I can make it. I can get through there even though it's red before any of these other cars get through there. You know, if something bad happens in that situation, don't blame God. You took a risk. You ever been in a hurry and you see that truck coming, but you need to get out on the road and you're pretty sure that you can make it, so you pull out anyway. You ever driven even when you knew you were too sleepy to drive? Ooh, that hits close to home, doesn't it? You know what? If you fall asleep and have an accident, you took a risk. It's not God's fault. Don't blame him. How about some of you handymen and handywomen who do your own work around the house? You ever change that light switch without turning the power off because you're pretty sure that you can do it without touching the hot wire? Yeah. Students, you ever decide you're just going to take a chance and not study for that test because you're pretty sure you can pass it anyway? You know what? Is it God's fault if you don't pass it? No, it's your fault. You took a chance. You took a risk. You know, God gave us a brain for a reason. And it's to use and to evaluate risk and consequence and not to proceed if the risk is too high. And sometimes a lot of tragedies that we see going around us, the answer really is, why did it happen? It's because somebody took a risk and it just didn't work out. Now, I want you to know, in spite of all this freedom that we have, God is still in control. Earth is not running amok, even though it seems like it. God is still in charge. And you know, one of these days, everything's going to come right back to the perfection that God originally made. But until then, we have the freedom. We have the freedom to sin. We have the freedom to be careless. We have the freedom to take risks. And sometimes it's just those common sense things that bring bad things on us. You see, God is not up in heaven, even though he's in control. God is not up in heaven looking down, micromanaging every thought we have and every action we take. He's not micromanaging every decision you make. You're free to make a lot of dumb decisions, just like I am. But when it happens that it doesn't turn out good, just don't blame him. Understand that a lot of times we just abuse the freedom that he gave us. You see, the only other option God would have had was to create us with no choice. Was to create us as mindless, thoughtless, emotionless robots who are incapable of making our own decisions, who are incapable of feeling, But the side effect of that would mean that we're also incapable of making our own decision about Him. You see, God's plan is not that we follow Him and trust Him and love Him because we have to. It's that we do it because we want to. You have the freedom to reject God's plan for your life. And I'll tell you, the most risky behavior of all are those of you who are sitting in here today and you don't know for sure that your sins are forgiven and that your eternity is in the hands of the living God, safe and secure. You're talking about taking a risk. Every breath you take is a risk that you will enter eternity without Him forever. Some of you in this room know I'm talking to you right now, and it's not because I'm really smart and can figure out who you are. It's because God's Holy Spirit is in this place. And He knows who you are. He knows your heart. He knows if you've never trusted Christ. And if you're feeling the tug through my words right now that you need to trust Jesus because you're engaging in eternally risky behavior, that's the Holy Spirit of God tapping on your heart, saying, today's the day for you. If you want to do something about that today, right where you sit, you can change everything. You can stop taking the risk of hell and get the assurance of heaven here today. Quietly in your heart, you just bow before God in your heart right now and admit what that one verse says you are. It says, all have sinned. Tell Him that you are a sinner. Just confess it to Him. And in telling that you truly believe Jesus went to that cross for you. And on that cross, He paid the price for your sin. And by His resurrection power, He can now offer you forgiveness and heaven. And then ask Him for it. Just ask Him to forgive you and come into your life.